Welcome to Varn Vlog Solo, and today I'm going to talk about a bunch of issues that are plaguing American political discourse. But first, we must start with the elephant in the room, Bernie Sanders. Bernie yesterday is reported in Politico as having told the Dems that they need to change course or expect a nosedive in November. Of course, how they change course, though, is not dealt with in the article, other than that they should actually provide things. After all, being known as the party that oversaw massive inflation, a massive increase in the price of energy, massive increase in the price of food, the inability to make a decision on forgiving student loans despite promises to at least forgive 10,000. And by the way, the recent hints of the Department of Ed is that they will be pushing payback further out, not forgiving the debt, although again they didn't say that. What they said is borrowers will have plenty of information about when debt will resume, indicating that Biden has signaled that he may not be doing the forgiveness after all. Okay, fine. You have Jerome Powell saying that the Fed needs to actively raise interest rates in order to weaken workers, despite the fact that profits are up in most industries. Now, there's an exception to that, and that is the profit rates in real commodity markets like food. Now, we've seen the beginning of major stock market crashes. That's not always the best way to predict a recession because it only predicts a flow of investment. But it's been consistent. While it's been fun to make fun of Bitcoin for its hyper volatility, the percentages of loss between Bitcoin and, say, Amazon stock value is about the same. Meaning that people no longer have faith that these intangibles, investment items, are going to be as useful, and that big tech's ability to actually continue capturing the market may not be possible going forward. The relationship between the end of quantitative easing and all that is yet to be seen. But Bernie Sanders pushed the Democrats belies a central problem. Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are actually popular where they're at. Yes, even in states like West Virginia, things like single-payer healthcare are popular, but the Democrats have no agenda of even patching up the Affordable Care Act, much less pushing for Medicare for all, despite 2 years of flirting with that under Trump. No, what you will get is another massive gun reform bill, which has no ability to go through the Senate, and very little else. The problem remains, and the problem with this national focus on politics has remained, that even if progressive policies are popular in red states, and often, by the way, they're more popular in red states than in New York and California. This is the thing. There's some fundamental problems with this situation. Bernie's right. The Democrats would do better if they had the capacity to actually provide on any of their programs they promised. But why they don't have that capacity is not just the bad faith of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. It is also that it is actually politically advantageous for them to do so, meaning that building the kinds of inroads into states like West Virginia and Arizona, despite the increasingly purplish demographics of Arizona, indicates that on a fundamental level, the Democrats either don't or can't push their agenda to rural people because they either can't enact it or have no intention of doing so. So this leads us to the most recent Twitter scuffle. Reports, this one reported by Jacobin magazine, that Bernie is not foregoing running against Biden in a primary challenge in 2024. Never mind having 2 primary losses behind him. Never mind being 82. My old friend Ben Burgess, who I will talk to about this on this channel, got annoyed with all the people pushing back on Bernie's third one when Jacobin magazine said it was a good idea on their Twitter. Now, there are 2 common arguments that you can make about this. The first one is that the Bernie Sanders campaign reinvigorated young organizers, and this situation led to the uptick in union organization in Amazon and in Starbucks and other areas. There are complications to that narrative, however. Union organizing in general decreased in 2020 and 2021. Union jobs were replaced with non-union jobs en masse in production. And many people quit long-standing unions, and union membership, which often spiked at the beginning of the pandemic in certain fields, I know it did in education, declined precipitously during the same time period. Reasons for that are complicated and vary from state to state and region to region, and sector to sector. But it doesn't change the fact that it happened. But it is too early to discount this new union movement as just smoke and mirrors and youthful gusto and socialist high on their own supply. The success of the Starbucks campaigning, while it is strategically limited and highly vulnerable because of the highly fractured nature of each shop, is heartening. And the opposition to it being real indicates that it is actually a threat. Chris Smalls and the Amazon local off of New York is huge for a variety of reasons as well. But in neither case is it clear that the Bernie momentum is why that happened. There's been a story that was told after 2020 by people like Adolph Reed, who I respect, that the Bernie movement's main goal was always to revitalize the workers' movement by giving them action. But this leads to the second argument that can be made, an argument that I also think may be too simple, that instead of Bernie boosting these campaigns, they actually detracted from them, having people enter electoral organizations and canvassing as opposed to organizing their workplaces. You will hear this been made by some left union pushers who have become very frustrated with the democratic socialist movement, particularly sometimes out of people attached to small organizations like the IWW. And the IWW, why it is historically large for a left organization, is still, I think, less than 7,000 people in total. The long durée of all this, however, needs to be looked at in a different way. The Democrats have failed on even their modest and milquetoast reforms. And they've turned on Bernie many times. He is both the conscience of the party and its scapegoat. You will see blue checks on Twitter imply that he's a Russian agent, or that he is working with people like Peter Thiel to sabotage the blue wave. No, I frankly think this is delusional in a variety of ways. Bernie's seat as part of the finance committee was also sold to me by many left-wing Democrats as the ticket to how the backdoor start to enact the Bernie revolution. This also has not happened. The reasons for that are the same structural reasons why the Democrats can't even get their milquetoast agenda through the Senate. And while socialists can call for things like the abolition of the Senate, the abolition of lifelong judiciary, etc. They have no means to enact that change through constitutional means. And if they were going to go to extra constitutional means to do it, they would need much larger and more militant supporters. These things, while they may be ideal planks on some ultimate program, have no game theoretical way to go through Congress at the moment. Every bit of this, in my opinion, is premature. And to really understand the situation that we're in, you need to get over the burnout or the burn again. You need to look at the situation in America beyond the lens of simple electoral politics. There is a deep divide in the U.S. about matters of life and death. And this divide is no longer just racial as it historically has been. I remember when I learned about this and learned about the difference in life expectancy between Black men in the South and white men in the South. Well, that gap has been closing, but not because of massive life expectancy gains for Black men. There's a deep divide in the United States on mortality. According to U.S. News and World Report, a deep dive into the widening mortality gap across the political aisle indicates that Republican counties, notice not states, counties, so even Republican counties in blue states like California, suffer from death rates that are not the result of the population's age. Indeed, between 2020 and 2022, the death rates in Democratic counties dropped from an average of 850 to 664 for every 100,000, compared to Republican counties, which dropped from 867 to 771 for every 100,000 residents. And this is not just from COVID, although we'll talk more about COVID in general. And these stats were before 2019. Stats from the pandemic actually indicate that this gap will even increase. But while Democrats have used this to say that it's an indicator that their policies and their political beliefs are actually what is driving the difference, there's a couple of asterisks we should really look at. Recently, Doug Henwood also talked about the difference in death rates and the difference in union activity rates and crushing of unions and the Great Resignation. And he painted the picture on his Twitter and as proof that Democratic policies were pro-union, and that in blue states you saw net benefits for people not resigning from work. Now, he ignored, however, that California was one of the states that actually trended a little bit more like red states in actuality. And the public sector unions in California are notoriously strong, from the prison guards unions to the teachers unions to the cop unions. They're all strong in California. So why did this picture not resemble the picture of New England, which is the other area that he was basing his generalization off of? And that is because the economic situation in California is very different and based on a completely different kind of work than in New England. And while trying to paint this as a matter of simple Democratic versus Republican policy, Henwood was actually understating the difference in the economic sectors in a way that benefits his current narrative of loyalty to the Democrats being productive. No. When you go look at the death rates, what you find is, according to Fierce Healthcare, residents of Republican counties are more likely to die, regardless of their personal political beliefs, So that does lend some credence to it might be policy driven. But then you compound this with another fact, that Democratic districts and counties tended to be richer and more urbanized. And that in 2020, the Democrats became a net richer voter-based party than the Republicans. Now, this is complicated by compounding demographics, but this is an undeniable fact, and that has historically not been true. Wealth has historically not sided consistently with the Democrats because wealth was not all in New York and California and other economies that are based on largely venture capital, finance capital, and intellectual property rights. Furthermore, is what is making these counties Republican policies, or that bad policies in general had led to these areas being poorer, and the conservatizing effect of stress and poverty had led to more allegiance to Republican politicians and their seeming bravado. It's hard to tell, particularly when you add into this the fact that each congressional cycle, Democrats and Republicans work together to make sure that the gerrymandered districts are less and less competitive. Even Republicans turning down the ability to gain new seats in order to save current ones. How much can any of this reflect any collective agency in these areas is hard to say. But what we can say for sure is that for people in rural and suburban America, getting shorter. And for the rich in cities that are democratically run, life is getting longer. It is hard to see the clear class politics in this, as we have often stated. The actual money base of both parties is, of course, bourgeois and different. Finance has tended increasingly towards Democrats over the past 20 years, as has insurance and other things, although they invest on all sides. I used to work for an insurance company that made it very clear that they were nonpartisan in their lobbying. But more of their money and more of those urban areas go to Democratic politicians. Conversely, the areas that are Republican tend to be in extractive or military-dependent economies. Military Keynesianism is the only thing that kept my part of Georgia afloat, and is the only thing still keeping any business in central Georgia now. And it has led to the growth of Warner Robins and the decline of Macon. Now, that's awfully specific if you don't know the history of Georgia. But Macon was a paper mill town, and then it was a manufacturing town, and it still has factories, but the factories that have replaced the old ones employ 1/10 of the people. And the biggest employer is the city and the school system and an insurance company. Meanwhile, it is not just the military itself, but things subordinate to the military and military contractors that have grown up around. Warner Robins, leading many people who live in Macon to go into that field, either into the military itself as a way out, seemingly that there is no other way out other than leaving and moving to a very expensive city, which is hard to do, I can tell you. Before I was hired to move abroad, I could not afford to move to New York, despite having a terminal degree. No. This has all been changed by the pandemic, and many people have been shown out of the only means most Americans have to have wealth, which is homeownership, and that itself will be going through a correction soon. That correction is likely to be ugly, but it won't play out the same way 2007 did, because even the tardigrade scandal in China right now is because the debt is not highly leveraged in financial instruments. What we're likely to see is a minor decrease in prices. But rents will probably not go down, and sufficient housing stocks do not yet exist, even in a country that has massive amounts of unused land. No. Bernie cannot answer these questions by himself. Whether or not you think the left would be good to support Bernie as another injection, despite a likely loss of an 82-year-old man on a third primary attempt, and despite the fact that Democrats would surely blame the statistical likely decline of Biden on Bernie and not on Biden's own policies, it might inject a little bit of mobility in ways that the DSA's recent decline and the older business unions' inability to capitalize off new unions have not. And indeed, judicially, there are threats coming that are very, very real that play in seemingly to the political base of two declining and sclerotically incompetent parties. After all, the more we're doing Rick DeSantis style cultural war battles, and your chances between DeSantis and Trump going on the culture comp, fighting CRT in every nook and cranny and calling any attempt to reduce teen suicide rates a socialist conspiracy. They are unlikely to be able to change inflation or anything either, as the policies are driven by things much larger than the United States. Indeed, all these problems are worldwide problems. We are having an energy crisis. Come on, we are having the overabundance of our food system fall apart because we've moved it from stocks to floats. We will see food riots. Water is beginning to evaporate in desert areas, and this water is often filled with arsenic. And while it will not lead to massive amounts of people dying of arsenic poisoning, this will be contaminating food water for alfalfa grown for food stocks all over the world, actually. Here in Salt Lake, for example. The Salt Lake is depleting. But these things have been happening in Central America and in desert regions for a long time now. And they're just now happening far enough north that people can't deny them. The lagoon where I lived in Mexico had already gone through the same process, and you would see the poor with patches of white on their skin from low levels of arsenic poisoning from having to drink city water. The middle class and the rich all bought purified water from private people and did not drink the city water. And then there were the rancheros that didn't even have the city water and were drinking rainwater collection, often contaminated with typhoid and other things, although they usually had developed an immunity to it by that time. Now, Mexico is not a third world hellhole, despite what people may tell you on the U.S. news. Parts of Mexico are just as nice as the United States. But the poverty difference there is far more apparent. And of course, now you'll have all the normal retreats into third worldism, because that is what people do when they have no viable local option. They blame local people for their failure and then put their hope somewhere far away. They might have good objective reasons for doing this, as overexploitation in the developing world is common, and in fact endemic. But this is not new. This is a cycle. It is a predictable cycle from the alienated, hyper-online left that you see go out in larger and larger waves of the population over time. The debates that we had in zines in the late 90s are not that different from the idiot debates we're having now on Twitter, except that involves orders of magnitude more disillusioned and alienated young people. And it is no longer just college students and those slightly downstream of them participating. We need clear, concrete goals, but they need to come from us and organically. But the complexity of our political system will unlikely be done by simple executive runs to electoral office. And there is an opportunity cost in continuing to focus on that and that alone. And we're running out of time. Every predictor indicates that the next election rounds, probably not just in the United States, will likely be reactionary. The exceptions seem to be primarily in parts of Latin America that didn't experience the pink wave the first time. So Colombia, Peru. Changing attitudes towards China will change this, but then China still needs Navy cooperation for ship to continue the development that it's trying to do in Latin America and Africa. And while the U.S. may be realizing that its gambit under both Trump and Biden and even Obama to try to see China as a world competitor, you will notice small things change back, such as the U.S. saying that it does not actually endorse the independence of Taiwan and recognizes the one China policy, even though it wants the status quo to de-escalate. Happened quietly, but it happened. And while the rhetoric against the West in China is probably pretty high, rightfully, you will see other things to try to pull it away from helping the Quad and Southeast Asia and allowing Modi to increase tensions between China and India. Oh, you see, I bring this up not because we can game geopolitics, as you have no effect on it, and people who think that you will have a revolution based off of this or that geopolitical answer in a country in which you have no influence are worse than fools. No. I bring it up because everything affects everything else. And national polities, despite the seeming fragility of globalization, will not be able to answer this alone. So burn in or burn out, it doesn't matter. What matters is what we do in response to that, who we incorporate into our networks, how we skill them, and help them prepare for an increasingly unstable global, national, and local environment. You will probably likely see violence increase. Talk of civil war is ridiculous in a country with a massive military that is politically neutral, as our military has traditionally been. But days of lead are not historically uncommon, and we've seen them even in the United States before. Go look up what happened and read the Days of Rage book, for example. Even if it is a conservative book, it will teach you a lot. I will link to the three of the articles that I mentioned in the show notes. Remember, solidarity first, but critical solidarity. Being unified for the sake of unity alone is kind of useless. Good night.